Good evening. Tonight, we begin with something that was never supposed to happen, something so fundamental, so unbelievable in the context of the last 3 decades of Eastern European geopolitics, that even seasoned intelligence analysts spent the first 12 hours asking whether the satellite images were real. At 6:47 a.m. on November 3rd, 2024, a Belarusian border officer at the Convoy checkpoint, the main crossing along the M1 highway linking Russia and Belarus, walked up to the lead vehicle of a Russian military convoy and issued an instruction that no Russian soldier, no Russian commander, and certainly no Russian political leader expected to hear us turn around. Not a few trucks, not a small supply column, but a convoy of 42,000 Russian military vehicles, a line of armored carriers, mobile artillery systems, ammunition transports, fuel tankers, and command vehicles stretching back more than 40 kilometers into Russian territory. A convoy that had been pre-authorized, pre-cleared, and pre-coordinated under the same protocols that have governed Russian-Belarusian military cooperation since the fall of the Soviet Union. And yet, on that cold November morning, the order from Minsk was unmistakably clear as Russia's military was not allowed to enter Belarus. Think about that. Belarus, Russia's closest ally, Russia's fallback staging area, the country that Putin once referred to as an extension of Russia itself, slammed the border shut against the very military whose protection Belarus has depended on for 4 years. The man who owed his political survival to Moscow, the man whose regime was rescued by Russian intervention during the mass protests of 2020, personally ordered that border closed. Alexander Lukashenko didn't delay the convoy. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't request paperwork. He issued a direct command. No Russian military vehicles enter Belarusian territory. But here's the first hook. This isn't a logistical dispute. This isn't a bureaucratic misunderstanding. This isn't a momentary glitch in an otherwise loyal alliance. What we are witnessing is the most explicit rupture in Russian-Belarusian relations since the day Belarus declared independence in 1991. This is a break so visible, so undeniable, that it can be observed from space. Satellite imagery captured the next day shows the convoy like a dark metallic scar across the border region. Row after row of Russian military hardware immobilized, their engines idling, their crews confused, their commanders frantic, their entire mission brought to a dead stop by Belarusian soldiers standing in their path. And here is what makes this moment truly extraordinary. This convoy represents roughly 15% of Russia's remaining mobile logistics fleet. These are the trucks that carry artillery shells to the front. These are the fuel tankers that keep armored units moving. These are the medical supply vehicles that sustain Russia's wounded. Months of planning, coordination, and consolidation, all of it frozen in place because Lukashenko said no. This is not traffic control. This is not routine. This is not politics as usual. This is the point where Russia's last meaningful alliance begins to crack in real time. And if you're thinking, surely Russia must have responded, surely Moscow must have pushed back, surely the Kremlin must have tried to resolve this quietly, consider this. As of tonight, Russian state media has not mentioned a single word about the blocked convoy. Not one headline, not one briefing, not one explanation. The Kremlin has erased the event from its official reality. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, analysts, governments, intelligence agencies, ordinary people with access to commercial satellite platforms can see the truth plainly. Russia's closest ally has just drawn a red line across the highway and told Putin he cannot cross it. To understand how we got here and why this moment may mark a breaking point in Russia's entire geopolitical orbit, we have to step back. Because this isn't just about 2,000 trucks. This is about 30 years of dependency, coercion, resentment, and political survival converging into a single command at a border checkpoint. And that story begins, as it always does, with the man who now stands between Russia and the final remnants of its influence. Alexander Lukashenko, Europe's longest-serving dictator, Moscow's most reliable partner, and now the man who has delivered Putin his most visible humiliation yet. In August 2020, when hundreds of thousands of Belarusians flooded the streets demanding Lukashenko's removal after yet another blatantly fraudulent election, his regime teetered on the edge of collapse. For weeks, Belarus looked like a country slipping out of authoritarian control. Workers walked off the job. State television employees resigned en masse. Protesters marched in numbers the country had never seen. And for the first time in his 30-year rule, Lukashenko looked genuinely frightened. Here's the second hook, as Putin saved him. It's Russia provided the propaganda, the intelligence, the money, the security guarantees, and the political cover that kept Lukashenko in power. Russian media portrayed protesters as Western puppets. Russian advisors helped Belarusian security forces track down opposition organizers. Russian financial support kept the Belarusian economy from collapsing under sanctions. Every authoritarian instinct in Lukashenko's arsenal was strengthened, legitimized, and reinforced by Russia. He owed Moscow everything. He knew it. Putin knew it. The rest of the world knew it. And that debt became even more explicit on February 24th, 2022, the morning Russian tanks rolled through Belarusian forests and down Belarusian highways as part of the assault on Kiev. Lukashenko didn't just allow it, he facilitated it. Belarus became Russia's launchpad for a war of aggression, and with that choice, Lukashenko tied his regime's fate entirely to Putin's war. At least, that's how it looked. For a while. But here's the thing about authoritarian alliances. They are stable only when both sides believe the other can deliver what they promise. Putin promised Lukashenko a quick victory. Putin promised that Ukraine would fall in days. Putin promised Western sanctions would fade. Putin promised Russia's dominance would remain unquestioned. None of that happened. The war dragged on. Russian casualties mounted. Sanctions multiplied. Belarus's economy contracted. International isolation tightened. And suddenly, Lukashenko, the man who staked his future on Russia winning, found himself chained to a sinking ship. By late 2023, Belarusian exports had cratered. The country had lost access to essential Western technologies. Inflation surged. Belarusians faced price hikes, shortages, and unemployment levels not seen since the 1990s. And every one of those economic shocks was traced back not to Belarus itself, but to its support for Russia's war. Inside Lukashenko's inner circle, resentment simmered. European diplomats who met Belarusian officials privately in 2024 reported increasingly blunt comments. Russia was draining Belarus, not protecting it. Russia was using Belarus, not partnering with it. Russia treated Belarusian sovereignty as an inconvenience, not a reality. And that brings us back to November 3rd, when Lukashenko, perhaps for the first time in 4 years, acted not as Putin's subordinate, but as Belarus's ruler. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was a direct challenge to Russian military authority. Lukashenko didn't simply say no. He's mobilized Belarusian armored vehicles to block the road. He deployed troops to the checkpoint. He ordered concrete obstacles placed across the highway. Anti-tank barriers appeared overnight. This was not diplomatic signaling. This was a physical, unmistakable line drawn in cold concrete and steel. Russian convoy commanders tried to negotiate. They invoked bilateral agreements, joint defense treaties, personal messages from Putin himself. For 6 hours, they pleaded, argued, threatened. None of it worked. Belarusian officers had Lukashenko's orders, and those orders could not be overridden by Russian generals. By the next morning, intelligence intercepts revealed frantic calls between Moscow and Minsk. Russia's defense minister demanded an explanation. Belarus's defense minister replied with a single line. Sekesar, the president's decision is final. Here's the third hook is that Lukashenko didn't blink. Not once. Not for a second. And that's when Russian military analysts realized something had changed, something profound, something structural. The alliance wasn't just strained. It was breaking. Russia's last reliable partner was no longer predictable, no longer compliant, no longer willing to sacrifice Belarus's survival for Putin's war. And suddenly the question was no longer, why did Lukashenko block the convoy? The question became as, what does he intend to do next? Seth, the answer, as we'll see, reverberates far beyond a single border crossing. It challenges the foundation of Russia's influence in its entire post-Soviet sphere. It signals to every former Soviet republic that dependence on Moscow no longer guarantees stability and may, in fact, guarantee ruin. More than anything, it marks the moment Russia discovered that even its most indebted dictator has limits. Limits that 2,000 stalled trucks now physically represent, lined up in the cold, engines off, waiting for an approval that is never coming. And that realization is where the real story begins. For the Kremlin, the implications were immediate and deeply unsettling. The blocked convoy wasn't just an obstacle. It was a message carved into the geography of Eastern Europe. Belarus is no longer guaranteed territory. For nearly 2 decades, Russian war planners treated Belarus as an extension of Russia's Western strategic depth. Every scenario, every simulation, every NATO response model assumed that Russian forces could move freely across Belarusian soil. It was a constant as reliable as geography itself. But constants in geopolitics have a way of dissolving without warning. And Lukashenko's refusal shattered one of Russia's most dependable strategic assumptions. Here's the next revelation. Lukashenko didn't act out of defiance alone. He acted out of fear. Not fear of Russia. He's lived with that for 30 years. But fear of something more immediate, more existential, Belarus becoming the next battlefield. Intelligence reports circulating among European security services in mid-October suggested that Russia planned to redeploy parts of its depleted Western military district into Belarusian territory for a winter push toward northern Ukraine. The idea was desperate, a last-ditch attempt to force Ukrainian forces to split their defenses, but it wasn't impossible. Moscow had done it before. This time, Lukashenko refused. He knew what inviting another Russian offensive through Belarusian territory would mean: Western sanctions doubling, NATO reinforcing its eastern flank, Belarus being cast not just as an accomplice, but as an active participant in a widening war. His economy couldn't survive it. His regime couldn't withstand it. And his population, already wary, already resentful, would not tolerate another step toward becoming Russia's battlefield. So he did something no one expected. He put Belarus first. It was a decision that came with enormous risk. Putin has publicly humiliated allies for far less. But Lukashenko calculated that Russia, weakened and overstretched, could not afford to open a second political front. Not now, not with its military bogged down and its economy suffering under sanctions. He sensed the Kremlin's vulnerability and he exploited it. And here's where the story turned sharply. For the first time since the war in Ukraine began, European leaders responded not with condemnation, but with opportunity. Within 48 hours of the border closure, quiet channels between Minsk and several EU governments became active again. These weren't public negotiations or grand diplomatic gestures. These were technical, level exchanges, the kind that usually occur right before sanctions are re-examined. Belarus, the diplomatic pariah of 2020, was suddenly being treated as a state with leverage, and Lukashenko knew it. Behind closed doors, he began hinting at possibilities that Western diplomats never expected him to consider. Limited economic openings, transit guarantees, even in the most speculative conversations, a phased withdrawal of Belarusian territory from Russian military use. Suddenly, Lukashenko wasn't acting like a vassal. He was acting like a broker, and that shift sent shockwaves through Moscow. Inside the Kremlin, the blocked convoy became the symbol of something far more destabilizing than a logistical setback. It became the proof that Russia's sphere of influence, once maintained through intimidation and dependency, was crumbling under the weight of its own war. You could hear it in the tone of the Kremlin's internal communications. You could see it in the frantic scheduling of emergency security meetings. You could feel it in the sudden tightening of Russian state media narratives. For the first time in decades, Moscow had to consider a scenario it never took seriously. West Belarus drifting out of its orbit, not pivoting west. Lukashenko is too cynical, too self-preserving, too entangled for that, but no longer obedient, no longer predictable, no longer controllable, and nothing illustrated that shift more clearly than those 2,000 trucks sitting helplessly at the border, their crews stranded, their mission aborted, their presence a reminder of the one thing: Putin cannot afford the appearance of weakness. Because if Belarus can say no, others might follow. And that is the geopolitical aftershock still rippling outward, the moment we're moving into next. Moscow's unease quickly turned into something darker. Not rage, not retaliation, but a silence. And if you understand the Kremlin, you know that silence is never a sign of stability. Silence is the space where uncertainty metastasizes. Russian officials stopped mentioning Belarus in briefings. Border authorities issued no statements. Military spokespeople avoided questions. The Kremlin behaved not like a state in control of the situation, but like a state calculating how much control it had already lost. Meanwhile, Belarusian state media, usually a loyal echo of Russian propaganda, adopted a tone that was subtle but unmistakable. Thus, Belarus is an independent actor. Belarus decides its own security. Belarus protects its territory for a regime that spent years parroting Russian messaging. This was a shift so sharp that analysts immediately flagged it. And then came the most alarming sign, not from politicians, but from the Belarusian military itself. 3 days after the convoy was blocked, the Belarusian General Staff released a carefully worded statement declaring that the deployment of foreign military activity on the territory of the Republic of Belarus will be regulated exclusively in accordance with national security priorities. Foreign military activity. Russian, not allied, not joint exercises, as foreign as if Russia were simply another outside power. For Moscow, that single word was more threatening than any troop movement, because once Belarus publicly frames Russia as a foreign military presence, the entire foundation of their alliance changes. It's no longer partnership, it's permission. And permission can be revoked. But the most telling developments weren't in the statements. They were in the movements on the ground. Within a week of the confrontation, Belarus repositioned 2 mechanized brigades along its eastern border. Mobile radar units were activated in regions previously left unmanned. Communications jamming equipment, typically deployed during internal unrest, was activated near the M1 corridor. And most critically, Belarus quietly suspended rail freight access from Russia for the first time since 2019. This wasn't theater. This wasn't Lukashenko bluffing. This was a country insulating itself physically, economically, and militarily from a partner it no longer trusted. Western intelligence agencies noticed immediately. One EU report circulated on November 12th summarized Belarus's actions in a single blunt sentence. Minsk is preparing for scenarios that do not include Russian cooperation. That assessment sent a shockwave through diplomatic circles. Because if Belarus, the country most dependent on Moscow, is preparing for a post-Russian future, then the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe is at the edge of a massive realignment. And Lukashenko, for all his brutality and unpredictability, understands one thing better than most. Thor's authoritarian survival requires reading the winds before anyone else feels the breeze. He knows Russia is weaker than it pretends. He knows the war in Ukraine drained Moscow's resources. He knows the Kremlin cannot afford a rift with its last remaining ally. And he knows opportunity when he sees it. So he seized it, not to abandon Russia, not to join the West, but to carve out something he hasn't had in years, negotiating power. Because here's the truth at the heart of the story. Lukashenko's loyalty was never ideological, never fraternal, never rooted in shared destiny. It was transactional. And when the transaction no longer delivered value, he changed the terms. Russia calls this betrayal. Lukashenko calls it sovereignty. History calls it inevitable. And that inevitability leads to the final, most consequential question, the one that both Moscow and the West are now asking: if Belarus can push back on Russia, who's next? Across the post-Soviet world, governments that once depended on Moscow watched the Belarus standoff with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. For years, Russia maintained influence not through soft power, not through prosperity, but through the illusion of inevitability. Countries stayed in Moscow's orbit because they believed there was no alternative, that stepping away invited punishment, destabilization, or regime collapse. But when Belarus, the country most vulnerable to Russian pressure, successfully defied Moscow without immediate retaliation, something shifted in the psychology of the region. In Armenia, government officials began openly questioning Russian security guarantees. In Kazakhstan, ministers intensified cooperation talks with China and the EU. In Uzbekistan, economic advisors quietly escalated efforts to reduce dependence on Russian transit routes. None of these moves were sudden. None were dramatic, but all accelerated after one simple fact became visible to every policymaker from the Baltic to Central Asia. Russia didn't stop Lukashenko, and if Russia couldn't force compliance from Belarus, the state it invested the most money, political capital, and military support into, then what could it force from anyone else? Here's the pivotal realization spreading through these capitals: Russia's power hasn't disappeared, but its ability to enforce loyalty is degrading. Lukashenko, for all his faults, recognized this before anyone else. And that's why his border blockade wasn't just a rejection of one convoy. It was a test, a deliberate probe of whether Russia still had the strength to punish defiance. And when punishment didn't come, Lukashenko pushed further. By the middle of November, Belarus had begun a quiet but unmistakable campaign to reframe itself not as a Russian appendage, but as a country caught unwillingly in Moscow's war. State TV rolled out a new narrative: Belarus wants stability, Belarus wants neutrality, Belarus wants economic recovery. Not once in these broadcasts was Russia mentioned as the cause of Belarus's problems, but the implication was obvious. Belarus was preparing an exit ramp. The propaganda machine didn't say it directly, but it didn't need to. The shift was already visible in the most unlikely place of all: public sentiment. For the first time since 2021, Lukashenko allowed limited online criticism of Russian policies to circulate without immediate censorship. Not anti-war protests, not Western praise, but small, carefully curated comments questioning why Belarus should be dragged deeper into Russia's conflict. This was Lukashenko's method: tiny signals, tightly controlled, meant not for domestic revolution, but for international negotiation. He wanted Moscow to see them. He wanted Brussels to see them. And most of all, he wanted everyone to know something fundamental: Belarus is no longer a foregone conclusion. But the Kremlin wasn't blind. They saw the shift. They understood the danger. And their next move, though subtle, revealed just how seriously Moscow took the threat. Russian military aircraft conducted low-altitude flyovers near the Belarusian border. Not violations, just close enough to be noticed, a message without words. Russian state media suddenly rediscovered its brotherhood rhetoric, praising Belarus as an eternal ally, a public embrace meant to mask private anxiety. And Russian diplomats began urging Minsk to resume normal coordination, a phrase that barely hid the desperation behind it. Yet none of these signals changed the reality on the ground. The trucks were still blocked. The convoy was still immobilized. The order stood axe, and the longer that line of military vehicles remained frozen in place, the clearer the message became. To the west, Belarus was signaling independence. To Russia, Belarus was signaling limits. To its neighbors, Belarus was signaling possibility. But above all, Lukashenko was signaling something he had not conveyed in years, perhaps in decades. I am not done yet. My regime will not die for Russia's war. In that one act of defiance, he reshaped the geopolitical narrative of an entire region. And the consequences, the real consequences, were only beginning to unfold. As the days turned into weeks, the blocked convoy became more than a diplomatic incident. It became a Gazan symbol, a physical manifestation of a shifting world order. Analysts started referring to it not as the border standoff, but as the line at Convoy, a fault line between past alliances and emerging realities. But the most important developments were happening far from cameras, far from checkpoints, far from the rows of idle Russian hardware. They were happening inside rooms where no microphones were allowed, inside the private channels connecting Minsk, Moscow, and European capitals. And in those rooms, a new kind of negotiation began. 5 hours Minsk's quiet recalibration. Lukashenko's envoys, once viewed as little more than Moscow's proxies, arrived in Vienna, Warsaw, and Vilnius carrying a message that stunned European diplomats. Belarus was prepared to discuss limited reintegration into the European economic systems. Not reorientation, not political reform, certainly not democratic transition, but economic access. Specifically, reopening certain export corridors through Lithuania and Latvia, partial resumption of potash transit, a phased easing of targeted sanctions, and the possibility of Belarus serving as a stabilizing buffer rather than a co-belligerent in Russia's war. In return, Belarus offered something Europe hadn't heard in years: a commitment to prevent Russian troop deployments on Belarusian soil without explicit Belarusian approval. This wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't binding, but it was a door, and a door from Minsk had not been open in a long time. European officials didn't celebrate. They didn't trust Lukashenko. They knew his history, his brutality, his opportunism. But they also knew the strategic value of even a small separation between Minsk and Moscow. And so they listened. The Kremlin's countermove in Moscow responded not with tanks or threats, but with something far more telling as economic pressure. Russian energy shipments to Belarus slowed by nearly 15%. A routine credit line extension was suddenly delayed. Russian customs began random inspections of Belarusian goods. The Kremlin hoped the hint of economic pain would shock Lukashenko back into compliance. It didn't. Instead, Belarus accelerated talks with China and TU Rakai for alternative energy deals. Even more astonishingly, Belarus began holding discreet discussions with Kazakhstan about shared transit routes that bypass Russia entirely. This was unthinkable 5 years ago. It was improbable even 1 year ago. But now it was happening because for the first time, Belarus was willing to endure Russian pressure in exchange for breathing space. The balance of fear had shifted. The intelligence leak. Then came the leak that confirmed everything Western analysts suspected. A Belarusian military official, speaking under strict anonymity, told a European outlet that Minsk had intercepted internal Russian communications describing a plan to formalize joint control mechanisms over Belarusian border operations. In plain language, that meant Russia intended to take direct operational control over Belarusian checkpoints. The convoy wasn't just a supply line. It was the first phase of an encroachment, and Lukashenko had stopped it. Whether or not the plan was definite didn't matter. What mattered was the perception. For a ruler obsessed with remaining the sole authority inside his country, the mere idea of Russian officers giving orders on Belarusian soil was intolerable. This leak electrified Belarus's political inner circle. For the first time in a decade, some elites began considering a question they never dared ask publicly. If Russia collapses or retreats, where does that leave us? And behind their anxiety was a more subversive thought. Maybe Lukashenko was right to draw the line as a pine face. The map begins to shift by early December. A subtle geographical transformation began unfolding. The border region where the convoy had been halted, once a seamless part of Russia's western military corridor, was now treated by both countries as a zone of controlled tension. Russia stationed drones near the area. Belarus increased its patrols. Satellite images showed new Belarusian checkpoints being constructed further inland, not aimed at stopping Ukrainian forces, but at monitoring Russian movement. It was the quietest form of separation, a slow, deliberate creation of distance. Nothing explosive, nothing overt, nothing that could be called a break. But unmistakably, step by step, Belarus was carving out space, strategic space, economic space, political space, psychological space. This was Lukashenko's method: fragmentation instead of rupture, erosion instead of rebellion, Pakatras, the unanswered question. And yet, amidst all this movement, one question remained hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break ice lakers. What happens to the trucks? As of the latest intelligence, the convoy still had not crossed the border. Some vehicles had been redirected, some crews rotated out, but the massive hardware, the original core of the operation, remained stalled. Because allowing them through now would mean Lukashenko backed down, and ordering them forward by force would mean Russia escalated. So they sat. Hundreds of engines quiet, dozens of commanders waiting, thousands of soldiers stuck in political limbo. And every day they stay there, their presence becomes a reminder of a reality neither side wants to admit. The old order is breaking, and nothing, not trucks, not treaties, not threats, can put it back together. But the world is now watching for the next turn, the next decision that will define whether this standoff becomes a recalibrated alliance, a long freeze, or the first step towards something far more profound, the unraveling of Russia's last true satellite. And that decision, as always, lies with one man in Minsk, a man who has suddenly found himself holding more leverage than at any point in his political life. But leverage is a dangerous currency, especially for a man who has survived 3 decades by trading fear, loyalty, and improvisation in equal measure. And as Lukashenko's newfound autonomy grew, so did the risks surrounding him. Because if Belarus was stepping away from Moscow, even subtly, even cautiously, then someone inside Russia would eventually try to pull it back. That moment arrived in the form of a single, unexpected phone call. There's the midnight conversation on December 14th. Just after 1:20 a.m., Lukashenko received a secure line request from the Kremlin, not through diplomatic channels, not through defense ministries. The request came directly from Putin's inner security apparatus, the people who do not waste time on polite wording. Lukashenko took the call. No transcript exists. But according to Western intelligence briefings provided later, the conversation lasted exactly 13 minutes, and both men left it with entirely different interpretations. Putin reportedly insisted that the convoy was part of a mutually agreed emergency reallocation, hinting that Belarus was in violation of defense accords. Lukashenko pushed back, insisting that Belarusian sovereignty was not negotiable. But two lines from that call, relayed by separate intelligence sources, became the subject of days of analysis. Putin: "We are not asking, the movement will resume." Lukashenko: "Not through Belarus. No threats were made. No shouting. No ultimatums. Just two immovable sentences." Two leaders speaking from the ends of their power, one declining, one clawing for space. And when the call ended, both understood the same truth. First, the border standoff was no longer a dispute. It had become a test of political survival. The Kremlin's miscalculation. The next morning, Moscow attempted a maneuver so predictable that Lukashenko had likely prepared for it weeks in advance. Russian media unleashed a wave of orchestrated narratives accusing Western agents inside Belarus of manipulating Minsk's decisions. This was supposed to pressure Lukashenko through public opinion. It didn't work. Belarusians didn't buy it. Europe ignored it. And most importantly, Lukashenko didn't flinch, because he recognized something the Kremlin had not yet accepted. Russian propaganda no longer shaped Belarusian reality the way it once did. Years of war fatigue, years of sanctions, years of watching Russia bleed men and machines had eroded the myth of Russian competence. For the first time, Moscow's messaging bounced off Belarusian society with barely a ripple. Internal Belarus, internal Russia. Meanwhile, both countries faced internal consequences they could not admit publicly. As inside Belarus, senior officials, long conditioned to defer to Moscow, found themselves forced to make real decisions again. Some welcomed it, others feared it. But all understood that the political ground beneath them was shifting. He saw as inside Russia, the mood was far more volatile. Russian military bloggers raged at Belarusian betrayal. Hardliners demanded retaliation. Even moderates expressed shock that Putin allowed the standoff to continue. And then something extraordinary happened. A prominent Russian ultranationalist figure, usually unwavering in his pro-Kremlin loyalty, posted a message asking, if Belarus dares say no, what stops Kazakhstan? What stops Armenia? What stops anyone? The post was deleted within minutes, but screenshots circulated for days. The message was clear. Belarus's defiance wasn't just a foreign crisis. It was a domestic humiliation. The surprise from Kyiv. Then, unexpectedly, a voice from outside the Moscow-Minsk dynamic stepped in: Ukraine. Ukraine's Security Council released a statement praising Belarusian restraint and urging Minsk to protect its territory from becoming a launchpad for aggression. It was not flattery. It was strategy. Ukraine understood something key. A neutral Belarus means Ukraine's northern front stays stable. A stable northern front means Ukrainian forces can remain concentrated where they are needed most. Kyiv wasn't supporting Lukashenko. It was supporting reality. And this sudden acknowledgement from Ukraine added another layer of pressure on Moscow, because now the world was treating Belarus not as a Russian auxiliary, but as a separate actor with separate decisions. Exactly what the Kremlin feared. There's the turning point when the engines went cold by late December. Drone footage confirmed that the bulk of the Russian convoy, thousands of vehicles, had powered down entirely. No movement, no progress. Crews inactive. Supply lines rerouted. It was no longer a temporary delay. It was a political monument. A monument to something that had not existed in years. A Belarusian refusal, and then came the moment that truly signaled a new phase in the crisis. Belarus began quietly disassembling sections of the road leading from the Russian border into the Convoy checkpoint. Excavators dug trenches. Asphalt was removed. Foundations for new fortifications appeared, not openly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, because Lukashenko was sending a message: not written, not spoken, but carved into the lands as Tivers. This border is mine, and Russia will not cross it without my permission. Sekakra, where the world now stands. So here we are, a Russian convoy trapped in place, a Belarusian president asserting sovereignty for the first time in a decade, a Kremlin humiliated but hesitant, a Europe watching an opportunity unfold, a Ukraine quietly relieved, a post-Soviet world recalculating its future. And above it all, one truth grows clearer each day. This is no longer just a standoff. It's a realignment, one that could reshape the balance of power across an entire region. Avis, what happens next? Whether Lukashenko doubles down, whether Putin retaliates, whether diplomacy intervenes, will determine whether this moment becomes a contained crisis or the first fracture in the collapse of Russia's influence over its last remaining satellite. And that next chapter is starting to form right now. In the end, the line at Convoy became more than a border incident. It became a mirror held up to an empire slowly losing its reflection. For Russia, it was a reminder that power built on fear cannot survive once fear begins to fade. For Belarus, it was the first breath of sovereignty in a generation, fragile, tentative, but unmistakably real. For Europe and the post-Soviet world, it was proof that even the closest alliances can fracture when the cost of loyalty outweighs the benefit. But the true significance of this moment lies not in the trucks, the trenches, or the phone calls. It lies in the quiet shift that followed, the recognition that a world long frozen in old arrangements was finally beginning to move. Alexander Lukashenko didn't become a Democrat. He didn't become an ally of the West. He didn't reinvent himself. He simply made a choice born of survival, calculation, and a rare glimpse of opportunity. Belarus would no longer be a battlefield for a war it did not choose, and in that choice, he revealed a truth Moscow has spent years denying. Even its most dependent allies have limits. And those limits are now being tested. The convoy still sits as a testament to that moment. Silent engines, idle wheels, a frozen procession marking the boundary between the past and what comes next. History may one day record this as the point where Russia's influence began to fracture, or where Belarus cautiously stepped toward a more sovereign future. Or perhaps the moment will fade into a larger, slower unraveling. But whatever comes, one fact is certain. The border that closed that morning did not just stop 2,000 trucks. It stopped an assumption. The assumption that Russia's reach was permanent, unquestionable, unbreakable. And once an assumption breaks, it never fully mends. The line at Convoy may not have sparked a revolution or redrawn a treaty, but it shifted something deeper. The balance of fear, the weight of loyalty, the direction of inevitability. And in geopolitics, that is how eras end.